Welcome to this lecture on text files. So far in this class we have talked about the different type of variables. We have talked such as lists or strings, for instance. We have talked about conditionals. We have talked about loops, iteration, the for and the while loops. We have also seen how we can define function, how we can call modules and so on. In many instances in programming, you will be dealing with files that can be text files, CSV files, and so on that contain information. So for instance, you could have a large file that contains temperature measured at different places on Earth, and you need to convert them from Celsius to Fahrenheit or vice versa. And likewise, you may have to estimate distances between a set of origin and a set of destination, and you want to call a function distance, but you want to use those two text files, and then the output should be stored also as a text file. So how to do this? How to open a text file for reading, for writing, to append some values, how to close a text file. All that is what we are going to cover in this lecture. Python provides many functions that are inbuilt to create, to read, to write, and also to append existing files. In this lecture, we will mostly focus on text files as opposed to binary files. And text files are specific in that each line of text in that file is terminated by a special character called the end of line. And in Python, that particular character is \n. So if I have, for instance, a statement like this one here, and I say, for instance, print Eric /n delmel, then that's what's going to result on the screen. You have Eric, and then as soon as you see this character, that is for a second line. The other type of files are binary files. There is, in this case, no terminator for a line like we had here, and the data is stored after converting into a machine understandable binary language. Here we are not focusing on binary files, but on text files, of course. We need to ask ourselves what we want to do with text files, and what can we do with text file. What are we going to do once the text file is open? Because in all of these particular built-in function, we're actually going to work with a file, and if that file does not exist, it's going to be created. Okay. So what do we want to do? Well, do we want to read the file only, and then you would use that particular argument here, or that particular mode? Do you want to read and write? That would be argument R+. Do you want to write only? That's argument W. Do you want to write and read? That would be W+. Do you want to append only? That would be A. Or do you want to append and read? And that would be A+. And so when you want to work with a file, you're going to say open that particular file, and then you're going to see in which mode you want to work, which that mode actually is defined as an argument in the function. So I think there are the one that we would use the most in this class would be the read, would be the write, and sometimes the append. Now, there are a couple of things that are important. When you open the file for either reading or writing, as you can see here, then the handle will be placed at the beginning of the file. So this is where you're going to start reading that file. Now, if you want to append something, as we have seen, for instance, for lists, when we want to append it, we'll add it at the end. And so that's why then the handle is placed all the way at the end. Now we're going to see how we effectively can open text file for reading, writing, and append as well. We're going to learn how to open, close, and write to a text file in the next videos. So how to go about opening a text file? So it's very simple. You have a function that is called open, and this would be the syntax that you would follow. File object is equal to open, the file name, and then the access mode. Now, why we call file object? Because from an object, you're going to be able to apply different methods and other functions later on that. Now, the file that you want to work with typically should be in the same directory as your Python code. It's a little bit more tricky in Google Colab, and I'll show some examples on that later on. However, if the file you want to work with is not in the same directory, which can happen, data could be located in other directories, then you should specify that full directory. And then that is essentially done this way. For instance, if your file is located in the temporary directory. Now, there is this thing you may have wondered, what is this R here? And we don't always use that, but the R can be placed before the file name here to prevent characters in that file name string to be treated as special characters. So for instance, you can see if you have something like a slash here temp, right? It may interpret it as /t, which means it's a tab. And you know that if you save to a text file, you can save, let's say, as a comma separated value, but you can also save as tab delimited. So how to make sure to prevent that? So that's a little trick to be aware of. And the syntax when it's applied would look like this one. File1, which is the file object, is equal to open, which is the function to open that text file. That text file you want to work with, or c/temp my file, depending on where it's located. And then, of course, the mode you want to use here, the append mode, but it could be writing or reading and other. There are 6 different modes that we saw that we enter as an argument here. Well, once you have opened a file, you also need to close it. Otherwise, it's possible that when you write to that file and then you don't close it, that nothing is actually going to happen. It's that file is still open. So we're going to close the file at the end of our code, typically using a close function, right? And you can see here that's syntax file.object, so that's the name of the file once we have opened. Remember, .close, and then you open the parentheses, but the arguments, there are no arguments, which is simply closing the file. So that's quite important. Now, next thing is, how do we write to a text file? For instance, there are actually 2 functions that are quite common. The first one is the one that we typically going to use the most, is simply the function write, and between parentheses you're going to have the arguments and what you want to actually write. So here we would have a file object, so the name of the file that we had opened earlier, .write, and then between the parentheses is what you want to write. So that string 1 could also be a very, very long sentence with forward or back /n. For instance, we'll see a few examples later on. And the other function that we can use is called write lines. So it's the same structure, file object dot write lines, and then in the argument is a list, for instance, or something else that is defined earlier or later in that sequence. Okay. Next, we are going to see how we can read a file in the different modes to do that. How do we read from a text file? We have different functions that we can use based on what we actually want to do. The very first one, used quite a bit, is called read, and that returns the read bytes in the form of a string. So it will read n bytes, and this would be the syntax that you would use, the file object dot read, and then if you don't specify a number of bytes, it will read the entire text file. We have then a read line, and it reads the line of the file, and returns it in the form of a string. So what we have here, the file object as the syntax, dot read lines, and then you would specify here the n byte as well. And the one that we also tend to use quite a bit is read lines. And so in this particular case, it would read all the lines of the text file, and it would actually put all these lines of the text file in a list where each element of that list is one particular line from that text file.
I'm going to show you how you can read a text file within Google Colab. So the very first thing that you need to do here is to go into these files, okay, and you may want to upload your text file that you want to work with here. So we make sure that it is actually uploaded in the right directory. So here I will navigate to week 6 and take example 1, which is this one. And of course, we'll be working with more complicated text file later, but that's fine. And we can see now it has been added here. Okay, so the very first thing that we want to do is to open that text file. So what you would essentially be doing, so let's call this file 1 and open here. And you can put here in quotes example1.txt, and the mode is reading. Okay, so let's see if that works. Okay, it didn't give me any error, so it seems that it's working. And one thing we can do then, if we want it, is to make sure that actually the the file is open correctly. So we could say, for instance, for I in file 1, for instance, then you can say, for instance, here print I. Okay, and so I would anticipate that this would actually print every single lines of that text file. We're looking at check right now. And indeed it does, but you see that there is a space. That's because of this end of line character that we have. Now, one thing that is always very important is at the end of this, you want to close your file. And so then you would simply do it here, file1.close. And run this. Okay, and now then the file is actually closed. Next, I would like to show you how to append to a text file. So here to the right is our text file here. And we're going to write a code here. We'll say file1 is equal to open here example1.txt, and now we are going to open it for appending. And how do we add text to an existing text file? Simply you take the name of that file, that variable, .write, and then you would open and say, okay, this is Eric, for instance, okay? And then you would of course close the file, file1.close. Okay, so let's run it. Okay, so this should have run, and so if you want to make sure, we just open text file here, and you can see here that it's been adding, this is Eric. Now, you can clearly see that there is a problem if I do this multiple times, so let's do it a couple more times, 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, and let's open the text file here. You can clearly see that here we have an issue that it simply keeps adding to the same line. So if we really wanted this to be added to a new line, right, you could put here before, well, typically you would have done it earlier, but you can do it before here, and we can see what happens. So let's do it a few more times, and let's open this text file here, and we can clearly see that now we are in a much better shape where that particular line is being added, but every time it's a new line, it's not just next to the previous characters. So this is how you go about adding text to an existing text file. Okay, next I'd like to show you how we can create a new file and write to that file. So let's take an example here. Let's say file2 for change is equal to open, and if that file does not exist, so we're gonna basically create it. Okay, so let's say here example2, okay, and .txt, and this is for writing purposes. Okay, and what I can add here, just one line at a time, and say file2.write. This is a text file, and so there are two ways you could do it. You could say again file2.write here made by Eric, for instance, and so on. Now, what you see here, and then you would do file2.close. What you see here is that there is no character that indicate the end of the line. So if you wanted to do it, you would do it like this. Okay. And another thing is, you know, you have this made by Eric, which is great, but this you could just put it right here if you wanted to. You don't have to have a separate every time, a separate line every time. And so let's see if this actually works. Okay, so it didn't give me any error. I can try to refresh here, and I see example 2 has been added. So let's see what example 2 is about. And you see this is a text file made by Eric. Okay, so we can see, but we have a little bit of a issue here where we have a little bit of space. So let's see, let's run this again. Okay, seems to have worked. And now this issue of that space has been solved. So you don't need to leave an extra space here when you write to a new text file.